Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be delving back into Warhammer Fantasy, the Old World, and talking about the new update to combat that GW just released on their Warhammer community. And I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised because after the reveal to how shooting was going to work, I was just thinking to myself, well, this seems like the same old, same old. There's not going to be any updates, any changes, any refinements. GW is just going to go with their old broken Warhammer Fantasy system and call it a day. They're hedging their bets, and they're not exactly going to make any improvements despite the many flaws that existed, which crippled the game. When I read today's community article, I actually had a little bit of hope for the game because the new rules for combat are actually, believe it or not, good. And not only that, but they go so far as to fix a lot of the issues that combat had in previous Warhammer Fantasy editions and essentially make combat very balanced and enjoyable. So, without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into it and see what exactly GW did with combat in the Old World. So first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be going over the recent Warhammer community article discussing how combat will work in Warhammer Old World and what this change means for the long-term survival of Warhammer Old World. Because as you guys know, it's not just about, throwing a game out there. It's actually about having the game survive and thrive within the community. Okay, so starting off the article starts off with 2 paragraphs basically explaining who can fight and who can't in Warhammer Old World when units are engaged in combat. So every model, regardless, in the front rank, fights. It doesn't matter if its base is touching enemy models or not. If you're in combat, your front rank gets to fight. And I'm also assuming if you're charged in the flank or the rear, you will get those models to attack back as well that are closest to enemy units. In addition, there are other models that could attack in deeper ranks, things like spears or, the Elgi scum that come across from the island of Uthran, things like that. They get to attack in multiple ranks. And that makes sense too, right? If you have a spear, you're going to be able to attack from a longer range. So attacking in multiple ranks with weapons like that makes sense. In addition, they also go into initiative, what models strike first. Now, this was one of the things that was always a little bit wonky in past editions because it seemed like one way or the other, either really fast models had all the advantages or really fast models had almost no advantages. So in 7th edition and prior editions, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, it has been a while since I've played either of those editions. So, again, feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on this. But everything was determined based on initiative. If you charged an enemy unit that had a higher initiative than you, you still struck last, regardless if you had charged or not. You did get a bonus to charge to your combat result, but that's about it. So if I was a dwarf unit charging into something fast, like a, Elgi unit or an elf unit, I would probably still strike last even though I charged in, unless they were carrying great weapons, and I believe elves had always strike first anyway, so that was never really a thing. And back then, if you did have a great weapon, it was essentially like a power fist or something like that from previous editions of 40k, you always struck last in close combat. But in 8th edition, they did something different. So instead of, going by initiative alone, they said, well, whatever unit charges in always strikes first. And what that did is that turned really fast units kind of on their heads. Now, all of a sudden you had, really slow units of dwarves charging into elf units and getting the first strike in. Now, this was great for a dwarf player like myself. I loved it personally. But it really wasn't fair to really fast armies that happened to get charged by slower units. So there was this either-or situation from the editions where either really fast units always struck first and always had all the advantages, or, even slow units charging in would strike first and the fast units lost all of their bonuses. In this edition, they're actually doing a little bit of a mashup, which I actually like. I think it's a balanced way to handle it. So units that are charging in get an initiative bonus. How much that initiative bonus is, they don't tell you. I assume it's maybe, +2 or maybe double your initiative, for example. That would make a lot of sense. If you're charging in, you get double your initiative, but if the enemy still beats your initiative, then they're going to strike first. So the example they give is stone trolls charging into sword masters. Well, sword masters are extremely fast and highly skilled infantry. Stone trolls are lumbering behemoths. They're very stupid and oftentimes need leaders to help them out and, kind of guide them where to go. So their speed and intelligence is going to be much lower. So even if they do charge, their initiative 1, I'm assuming they're getting, double their initiative for charging, which is initiative 2. They're probably still going to strike, obviously after any units that are quick, like sword masters. However, they still have the chance to strike first against, much slower units. Skeletons are typically very low initiative. Things like dwarfs are low initiative, even though dwarfs are a little bit faster than skeletons, I believe, or the same speed, maybe. I think they're both initiative 2. So stone trolls may still strike first against those targets, but not against targets like elves and stuff like that. So I think that is a very good way to handle striking first in close combat. And of course, what I assume this also means, and now this isn't set in stone, this is a little bit of speculation here, but weapons like great weapons and other unwieldy types of weapons that you would, usually strike last with in past editions are actually just going to be a negative modifier to your initiative. So unless you're high elves, which I am going to assume are probably not going to, be penalized by, great weapons and stuff like that, they probably won't be. But if you're any other faction in the game carrying a great weapon, you're probably not going to always strike last. You're probably just going to get a modifier to your initiative. So a dwarf unit, having a great weapon, a great axe, or a great hammer or something like that will probably strike at initiative 1, whereas, a normal dwarf would probably strike at initiative 2 if it had a hand weapon. Now, this is actually kind of a cool change as well because it means that slower units with great weapons don't have as big of a penalty to carrying a great weapon as other factions might. So, if you're playing Dark Elves and you don't necessarily have that same, kind of high elf buff where you're not suffering the penalty to having a great weapon, that actually might be something to consider. Do I want to strike, after my opponent does, if I choose to take a unit of Hargoneth Executioners or something like that, right? So Hargoneth Executioners might be extremely, fast, but because they have great weapons, they might just be a little bit slower than other elf-type units. And it could also be a very good consideration for any lords you have in your army. So if you have a lord or a hero accompanying units, they're going to technically have a different initiative value than the warriors around them based on their weaponry and stuff like that. So again, this is just speculation. I don't know if that's the case or not. They might just say, oh, nope, great weapons strike last always. And, of course, high elves are immune to it. They get the, exception to the rule, so to speak. But everybody else that carries a great weapon strikes last. They might just go down that route or, based on what I'm seeing on this, kind of initiative style combat system, they might actually have great weapons just give you a penalty to your initiative, which is a good and balanced way to deal with it, in my opinion. As far as rolling to hit and weapon skill, it's much more straightforward than the ranged one that we went over last time. Honestly, I just really disliked how they dealt with rank and file ranged in this game for basically the whole time Warhammer Fantasy was around. I've always disliked how they dealt with it, and I understand that range is not supposed to be as good as combat in Warhammer Fantasy and stuff like that. But it's always been super, super weak to the point where, you're paying a lot of points for essentially nothing. At least that's how I always felt about it when I was playing Warhammer Fantasy, So, again, some of you may have had different experiences. And I know in the latter end of 8th edition, stuff like that near the end when, different armies were getting their codexes and army books, shooting was a little bit more powerful from some of those factions like Skaven. And of course, later on, dwarfs did also have some pretty good artillery and shooting, and dwarfs have always had good artillery as well, but I've always felt that the basic rank and file shooting units were always weak. And so I didn't really like when I saw GW reveal the shooting phase, how they dealt with rolling to hit with shooting units. However, when it comes to melee, I think they pretty much got it right. So rolling to hit is based off an opponent's weapon skill. The higher it is, the harder it is to hit, but it caps out at 5+. So you're never going to have a situation where you have a really low, skill unit like goblins or something like that, hitting enemy units on anything greater than a 5+. So you're always going to have a chance to at least get a few hits in, which I think is important. You also hit lower weapon skill enemies easier to a maximum of a 2+. So, your lords and your heroes and stuff are going to have a really easy time hitting, lower skilled enemy units, which also makes sense. And I think the great thing about this chart as well is it's not overly complicated. It is more complicated than 40K. Let's be real here. It's a chart. Anytime you have a chart like this, it's going to be more complicated than just having fixed values. But it's not hard to learn, and it makes sense from a realistic standpoint. So the thing about this chart is it's not overly complex. You don't have 6 pluses. You don't have 6s followed by 6s. You don't have any of that ridiculous stuff that shooting has. And you don't have a ton of different modifiers and stuff, which, by the way, that's one of the reasons I really dislike shooting and how GW did shooting. I know I sound like a broken record by now, but it's just overly complicated for no reason. And I hope they reassess that down the road. And I think they probably will end up doing something to shooting because it's just really bad for certain units. But anyway, I'm getting off topic now. The way they did the weapon skill chart is actually very good and well designed. And it's really not too difficult to actually memorize and understand. Combat is calculated by the number of modifiers, not just kills. So in other games, you kill a certain amount of units, they kill a certain amount of you, and you basically compare them, and whoever kills more, deals more wounds, wins combat. But that's not how fantasy works. That's not how Old World works. So combat is going to be calculated through a number of modifiers in addition to having more kills. And this is also a pretty easy to understand chart. You get points for kills, having additional ranks. I don't know whether there's a cap to this or not. There could be a cap of 3 like they've had in the past, or maybe not. I don't know how they've chosen to go about that. But either way, I think that's still pretty good. You get points for having a standard bearer, which you pay extra points for. Flank and rear attacks, of course. Having the high ground and overkill. So overkill is something in past editions where if you killed an enemy character by a substantial amount, like, your lord went against an enemy champion and you killed them by like 4 wounds, you got those additional overkill wounds as bonus points. So it was basically really demoralizing to see your general or your hero be slain by such a, massive amount. And that would be represented by overkill. Now, I'm not so much of a fan of overkill myself. I think it's kind of, maybe you should get 1 point out of it, or maybe an additional point on top of whatever else you got as far as wounds go. But I just thought it was kind of something that was a little bit off as far as balance, because some characters could overkill by a massive amount. So, you could overkill something by like 4 or 5 wounds, and that was just automatically a win for your unit, even if your unit didn't kill anything. But, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just kind of annoying when it happened. But, that was just me personally. That wasn't, I'm not saying that was an OP mechanic or anything like that. That was just my personal opinion. So this is pretty standard from what we've seen in previous editions. And this in and of itself was solid and had very few balance issues. Again, aside from like overkill, which I didn't personally like, but, other people did like, and it wasn't like an OP part of it or anything like that. It's pretty standard. And again, in my opinion, a very good way to calculate combat in a rank and file game. So then we come to the most important part of the article when they start talking about break tests. So we could talk about combat and how combat is resolved and who gets to attack and everything like that, modifiers, whatever it is. We could talk about all that stuff and all of it could look good. If this part of it sucked, it would still be bad, and it would still probably be a very big problem in the game when it came out. And I'm happy to say that's not the case. Games Workshop, luckily, realized that this part of the game was bad in previous editions, and they worked to fix it so that it's better, which is what they should have done with shooting, but that's just my opinion again. Okay, so break tests. This is how they work. When you lose combat, you have to roll a leadership check. Now, what differs from Old World from previous editions of fantasy is that the loser doesn't automatically just flee. In past editions, if you rolled your leadership and you failed it, and by the way, it's modified by however many, points you lost combat by. If you failed it, the enemy had a chance to catch you no matter what. Even if you only failed it by 1 point, you still failed, you still fleed, and the enemy could catch you and destroy your entire unit, which was insane. So if you had one unlucky combat, the enemy could run you down relentlessly, which was really bad. I thought it was a really bad mechanic that, you could just get wiped out so easily, and that was basically game over at that point. If an enemy got a really good combat against you on the flank of your army, broke you, ran you down, and ran into the next unit and maybe did the same thing to them, it was just over in a matter of maybe 2 turns. However, GW has fixed this. So now, instead of always breaking and fleeing, there's 2 different other results that can happen. So 1, if the natural roll that you roll, so on 2 dice, is higher than the base leadership of your unit, then the unit breaks and flees. So this is the disaster scenario, right? This is the scenario where your unit just automatically breaks, flees for the hills, and the enemy unit can then run you down. But that only happens if the natural roll, which means just 2d6, unmodified, it doesn't matter how much you lost by, if the 2 dice that you roll are higher than the base leadership value of that unit, then they break and flee. And usually these leadership values are pretty high. So this is the leadership value that is posted on your data sheet. If you have a lord nearby or something like that, that will give a bonus to your leadership. If the roll, however, is still failed, so if you still failed the leadership check, but only because of the modified result of that leadership check by losing combat by however many points, then you don't break and flee, you just fall back in good order, which means even if the enemy catches you, you're not destroyed. The enemy unit just counts as having charged again. So they kind of keep up the momentum. They're winning combat. They're going to keep up, the momentum and stuff like that, which makes sense, right? You're going to keep up the initiative if you're winning combat. But you're not going to totally destroy the enemy unit and wipe them off the board. So I think that's a fantastic change. And this was actually something that I was rooting for and that I had suggested in previous videos that they needed to fix. So I'm glad they actually did fix that. And lastly, if the modified roll is lower than the leadership value, so basically if you pass your leadership test, then the unit gives ground. But so what I assume this is you move a couple of inches back or something like that, and you re-engage and there's no negative penalties for it. And to me, this is a phenomenal change because it makes combat a lot more balanced and dynamic. High leadership units, unless really unlucky, will rarely just break and get run down from being charged, which was awful. If you guys have ever played a high leadership elite army in Warhammer Fantasy, you guys know how lame it was to fail a leadership check and then get run down by something. And your 400-point unit or whatever is just brutally run down and, maybe it wasn't even your fault. You just barely missed that leadership check, right? Because of the modifiers. Well, now that's not going to happen unless you're really extremely unlucky and you roll really high. So typically lords and stuff like that will have leadership 9 or 10. So unless you roll an 11 and then with a reroll, you roll another 11 or a 12, you're not going to actually break and flee. Low leadership units still have a chance to not instantly get run down either, although it will be more common for them. So the other thing that still sucked was if you had a, moderately priced or a low priced unit that was kind of more on the cheap side, like Empire Spearmen or Swordsman or something like that, it still sucked to roll your dice and lose a whole unit, right? And this time, in Warhammer Old World, low leadership units like that do have a chance not to instantly get run down either. So your more average leadership units or, your lower leadership units with hero or general support won't just instantly get run down by the first cavalry charge that your opponent makes. So after the combat is resolved and you count up the points and one side wins, the unit that wins gets to choose what they do next. They can either restrain themselves and keep their position and reform, or they can choose to pursue. So if you pursue and you catch a fleeing unit, so that's a unit that failed its leadership check by a lot, so they failed their natural leadership check, then it is destroyed. But if you catch one that is just falling back and not fleeing, then they count as having made a charge. They keep up the initiative, but they do not destroy the enemy unit. If you wipe out a target, however, so if you wipe them out to the last man, you can overrun them and move directly forward, your movement value in inches. And if you engage another unit while doing this, it counts as having made a charge. So if you wipe them down to the last man, if you're going against an unbreakable unit or something like that, then you can still use your momentum to your advantage. So it's a really good thing for cavalry to have something like this because usually cav is based on being able to wipe out an enemy unit quickly and go on to the next target. If they're not able to do this, then they're not very strong. Typically, they do worse in prolonged combat. So, being able to, charge an enemy unit, wipe them out completely, and then overrun is a good mechanic to have for a cavalry unit. And of course, this also has some great counterplay, because if you are able to hold against that enemy cavalry unit, then they're not going to be doing so great in the subsequent turns of combat, because typically cavalry, they're more expensive, they have less attacks in total, they really do, kind of operate on the assumption that they're going to win combat within a few rounds. And just seeing the kind of back and forth and counterplay that can exist between these units in combat really shows that this system is a much better system before, that has a good balance. Lastly, they do talk about combat magic. So once again, it doesn't seem like the spells are too OP. They are strong in certain scenarios, but they're nowhere close to what they were before. Hammer Hand will probably kill a couple of models in combat, and I assume this will also be, counted towards your combat result, which is powerful, but it's not super powerful. It's not OP. It's not going to destroy the whole unit. And Soul Eater might kill a character. So might kill a character with a couple of wounds, 3 wounds, but it has a, casting value. You have to cast it first of all, and then it's only a strength 3 hit. So you might not even wound, and then the enemy lord or hero will get a ward save or a, regeneration save if they have it. So yeah, it might kill a character, it might not. It could be powerful, it might do nothing. That's the risk you take when casting magic. And pretty much that puts it at the same level as just a regular character attacking in melee. It's overall no weaker and no more powerful. So if you have a hero in your army that has a great weapon or a runic weapon, it's attacking an enemy character, it's going to do about the same thing as Soul Eater does. And, same thing for Hammer Hand. A character with a great weapon is probably going to kill a couple of rank and file models. So nothing too overpowered, nothing too insane. All right, so what does this change mean for the long-term survival of Warhammer Old World? So I'm just going to say this right off the bat. Combat is vastly improved from what it was in previous editions, allowing for increased immersion and a more balanced experience. I can already tell just based off the rules that the mechanics to combat in Old World are good. And unlike how the rules for shooting with rank and file units work, combat is realistic and the rules are clearly designed to reflect that. And yes, I don't think they did rank and file shooting correctly, but it seems like they're stepping in a good direction with other things, which is a good sign. So for those of you who are going to look forward to Warhammer Old World, this is a great sign. You should be rejoicing at this. This is something that, is obviously very telling that GW is listening to its community for the most part and making changes to ensure a balanced game, which is good, right? Now, my personal opinion, obviously, like I've said many other times, and I probably will never stop saying it, because as a dwarf player, I love my handguns and I love my ranged attacks and stuff like that. But despite the fact that they really did shooting dirty, at least with the rank and file units in Old World, I think they did a stellar job with the combat, and this means that GW can learn from their mistakes. It's possible for them to actually learn, and it does look like they've put some effort into this. Whereas, with the shooting phase and stuff like that, it didn't look like they had put a lot of effort into it, but it really does look like they put a lot of work and, thought into this. So, for the most part, I like to think of myself as a very objective person in general, an objective player when it comes to games. If the rules are well designed and deserving of praise, I will give it. If the rules aren't deserving of praise, I will be a critic. I will criticize the rules, right? And that's exactly what I did in my last Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer Old World video when I talked about the shooting phase. But as an objective person, I have to say the combat phase looks pretty well done, looks really fun, looks balanced. And for those of you going to play Old World, it's going to be a great time. So definitely, props to GW for actually creating some pretty good rules surrounding combat in Old World. So, in conclusion, even though the jury is still out on whether Old World will be a well-designed and balanced game overall, the way combat works does go a long way towards convincing me the game won't just be a carbon copy of previous editions' poor mechanics, which I was fearing after I saw how they handled shooting. And though I do think it's a shame they didn't choose to go a different direction with the shooting phase, the things they did with the combat phase were much needed and should be applauded, because now, people that are going to play Old World can rejoice. They're going to have an actually balanced combat system when they start playing the game in the new year. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel and become a patron, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description. I also am an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description as well. I've also officially restarted the Eldar Knights Kickstarter on the channel, so if you didn't get a chance to support it last time around but want to see some cool artwork and stuff for the final draft of the Eldar Knights fan decks, then you can check out the link in the description and support it if you want to. Lastly, we are going to get back to some Eldar content within the next couple of days. I have a video coming out on Wave Serpents and Falcons for you guys and how to position them on the battlefield and how to use them in general. Eldar transports are a little bit tricky to use, so I'm here to help you out with that. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.